Okay, welcome back to this third part of chapter 14. Again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. We're still looking at monetary policy at a more in-depth level. Um, and now we're going to be looking at two markets, specifically the federal funds rate market, okay? And also the market for bank reserves, and basically how these two markets essentially influence monetary policy in the United States, okay? So these are the two markets we're actually going to be looking at, okay? Well, we know that the federal funds market basically is the market for the federal funds rate, right? But how does it actually influence monetary policy? Well, in the federal funds market, the higher the federal funds rate, the more money supply decreases, okay? So when the federal funds rate, let me just call it FFR, increases, right, money supply decreases. Now you're probably wondering to yourself, well, Dr. Kwaku, why does that happen? Okay, let me just break it down for you. Now remember, the federal funds rate is the interest rate at which banks basically borrow and lend from each other. Now, if the interest rates at which banks borrow and lend from each other, think of these multinational banks and these huge banks, okay? Right, now if the interest rates at which banks basically borrow and lend from each other increases, right, that means that banks and financial institutions can't borrow as much from each other, and hence they don't create enough loans for the public, right? Because they don't have enough profits or money in the first place to do that. Okay, so their money supply basically decreases, okay? So when the federal funds rate increases, banks and financial institutions are more reluctant to borrow and lend to each other, okay? And in that sense, basically, money supply will actually decrease, okay? Now, the lesser the federal funds rate, the more money supply increases, okay? So when FFR basically decreases, money supply basically increases, okay? So when the federal funds rate basically decreases, banks are more willing to basically borrow from each other, okay? So they borrow more money, they have more capital, and basically they loan the money out. Now, if banks basically loan money out, they tend to create money, okay? Right? So there's more money supply in the economy or in the markets, okay? So the lesser the federal funds rate, the more money supply basically increases, okay? So right off the bat, you can see there's a negative relationship between the federal funds rate and money supply. The federal funds rate increases, money supply basically decreases, okay? And if the federal funds rate decreases, money supply basically increases, okay? Now, let's look at how the market for bank reserves work, okay? Every time we talk about bank reserves, think of the fraction of money that is basically saved in a vault. Okay, so fraction of deposit that is basically kept by the bank. Okay, right, like I said earlier, basically banks take your deposits and they use the same deposits basically you've actually put in the bank to actually loan to people, okay? Right, so in that sense, if the federal funds rate is really high, banks know that they can't really loan or borrow money from other banks, okay? Right, so in that sense, they know they can't create as much money. So just in case you actually come in to withdraw your money, they need to have your money there, okay? So if the federal funds rate is really high, bank reserves tend to be high as well. And if the federal funds rate is low, bank reserves tend to be low as well, okay? Right, if the federal funds rate is low, banks know that they can easily borrow money from other banks. Hence, suppose you come for your deposit, you can easily get it, right? So they don't really keep a fraction of your money in their vaults because they actually lend it out to actually make a profit. If the federal funds rate is really high, they know that they can't borrow as much from other banks or other financial institutions, so they keep a large part of your money just in case you come in to basically withdraw your money. Now, let's look at two other interest rates, okay? Now, the Fed, remember I said it's a central bank, and basically a central bank is a bank to all other banks, right? So if your bank needs money, it basically goes to the central bank. If your bank basically wants to store money, it essentially goes to the central bank, okay? So the Central Bank of the United States is essentially the Federal Reserve, okay? Now, the interest rate at which the Federal Reserve charge banks, okay, especially banks who come to the Federal Reserve to basically loan money, is known as the discount rate. Okay, is known as the discount rate. So the discount rate is basically the interest rates charged on overnight loans made by banks from the Federal Reserve. Now, if the discount rate is high, banks are more reluctant to actually borrow money from the Federal Reserve. So in that sense, they don't have enough money or capital to basically increase money supply. So if the discount rate is high, or if the discount rate increases, money supply basically decreases. Okay, the beauty about economics is that the opposite is always true. If the discount rate is low, banks can borrow as much money from the Federal Reserve and hence create more money. So money supply basically increases if the discount rate is low. Okay, another tool the Federal Reserve basically uses in terms of monetary policy is what we call interest on reserves, and this is really new. It was sort of invented in 2008 after the financial crisis. Okay, right. So banks also keep money at the Federal Reserve for safekeeping. Okay, now if a bank keeps money at the Federal Reserve, right, basically the money being kept at the Federal Reserve is known as reserves. Okay, reserves held at the Fed. Okay, right. Now, if the Federal Reserve decides to give higher interest on reserves, banks will keep a lot of their money at the Federal Reserve, and hence they'll have less money to create for the public. Okay, so that would decrease money supply. Okay, on the other hand, if the Federal Reserve basically has low interest on reserves, the banks basically have no incentive to basically keep money at the Federal Reserve, and they basically actually loan their money out, actually increasing money supply in the economy. Okay, so you need to know all these key relationships. They're very important to actually understand how monetary policy basically goes on. Now, the next thing we'll look at is basically the monetary policy transmission. Okay, so how does monetary policy basically sort of translate to the GDP or price level of a country? Okay, so with this, we do what we call a quick overview. Okay, now we'll just summarize things, but I'll basically explain everything as we go on. Okay, now when the Federal Reserve lowers the federal funds rate, how does the Federal Reserve actually do this? Well, it basically buys bonds from the public. Okay, so when we say it buys bonds from the open market, we're saying it basically buys bonds from the public. Now remember, there's an inverse relationship between the price of a bond and the interest rate on the bond. Okay, right, or the market interest rate. Okay, right, if the price goes up, the market interest rate goes down, hence the federal funds rate also decreases. Okay, now you're probably wondering to yourself, well, Dr. Kweku, how does the price of bonds basically increases? Remember, every time in economics, when there's high demand for something, right, so they're purchasing bonds. Okay, so it means there's a demand for it. When there's massive demand for something, its price basically increases. And we know that the price of an asset is inversely related to the interest rate of the asset, so the interest rate basically decreases. And that is how indirectly the Fed basically lowers the federal funds rate. Now, think of the federal funds rate as the yardstick for all other market interest rates. If the federal funds rate decreases, other short-term interest rates in the economy will also decrease. Okay, and if short-term interest rates basically decreases, people will actually go to banks asking for loans because it's actually cheaper to get a loan now, and banks will be willing to give out those loans, okay, because they want to make a profit. So in that sense, right, the quantity of money will basically increase because people will actually have more money now. At the same time, the supply of loanable funds will also increase, okay, because there's more money supply, so people will feel compelled to actually save more money. Okay, right. Now, if there's more money supply and people feel wealthy and they save more money, and the supply of loanable funds increase, the real interest rates will fall. Well, you're probably wondering to yourself, how will the real interest rate fall? Well, remember the supply of loanable funds, or the loanable funds market. Okay, so we have demand for loanable funds, and we have supply of loanable funds. Okay, we have the real interest rate, and we have loanable funds over here. if the supply of the number of funds increases, what direction does the supply of the number of funds curve shift? It's basically going to shift to the right. So you get a new supply of the number of funds curve here, which is SLF1. And essentially basically get new interest rates over here, right? So clearly we can see that the real interest rates basically decreases, okay? So the real interest rate is going to decrease. Now, if the real interest rate decreases, right, consumption expenditure will increase, because remember, if interest rates on your credit card decreases or interest rates on your credit card are near to zero, you decide to actually spend more of your credit card, okay? So if interest rates decrease, people take out loans and they decide to basically splurge and spend, okay? So consumption expenditure increases, and also investments will basically increase, okay? So again, investment is purchasing of capital goods or machinery or equipment by firms to produce other goods and services. Now, if consumption expenditure and investments increase, aggregate demand in the economy will increase. Why? Because remember, aggregate demand basically involves all total expenditure on GDP. Now, aggregate demand is Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay, so if C increases and I increases, holding G and NX constant, Y will also increase, and we know that Y is basically synonymous with aggregate demand, okay? Now, if aggregate demand increases, we know that GDP will also increase and inflation rates will increase. Well, how? You're probably wondering to yourself, well, look at this model. We have aggregate demand, which is downward sloping, and we have aggregate supply, which is upward sloping. Okay, so this is the short run aggregate supply. In the short run, we have equilibrium point at P star, and we have our price level over here, and we have GDP over here. Now, if aggregate demand basically increases, aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. GDP, which I'll denote by G, clearly increases, and the price level also increases. Okay, so the price level basically increases to, let's say, P double star. Okay, so if the price level increases, basically that's inflation, and if GDP increases, that is basically GDP growth or economic growth. Okay, so that is how monetary policy basically works through the economy. Okay, so I'll stop this version of the video here. And I'll continue on the next video. Thank you.